Hello everybody, it's been a little while since you last heard from me because I have been very busy. Everyone else has been very busy because we do have very busy lives, but when we are free, we try to come back here to deliver some content. And I suppose I should start from the most obvious. My name is Icarosaurus and I'm here joined with one of my friends and moderators. And Is it fair to say last time I introduced you as a paleo intern, John? But does that still apply, or have you changed the status, if you will?
I am still an intern at my local museum, but I am on the way to hopefully getting somewhere deeper into paleontology besides a internship, which, mind you, I like a lot. I think last time I was doing invertebrate fossil stuff, but now I'm working on vertebrate stuff, which is my personal bread and butter. So it's a step up, I would say.
Well, that's good to hear indeed. We will definitely be keeping an eye, and whenever you feel like, if you feel like, of course, sharing any more details, then give me a shout and maybe we will talk about that someday as well.
Sounds good.
Okay, dokie. Well, why don't we get into this now and just let our viewers know what we're up to. So we have been planning this for quite a while. You will definitely remember that we have had a video, well, it's a video podcast, if you will, produced recently about the documentary in general and just overall reconstructions. Not really, yeah, it's more like about reconstructions than documentaries, really. But I do think that part of the video included some aspects of documentaries, since the general arguments do apply anyway. And that would probably be quite helpful if you were to go back and watch that video just to get a bit more understanding of what we normally look at when we are talking about certain aspects of a reconstruction, because this might come in handy as you listen and watch this video. Listen to the either podcast, or if you're gonna be actually watching, then you will be seeing a few things too. But if you're, of course, driving in a car, then I strongly recommend either finding a safe place to stop or just simply put it on the audio only. Uh, but in any case, to give you a brief summary, we have decided to introduce a new series to the channel where well, it will mainly be me and John. There might occasionally be other people that we might invite to do it as well. But primarily at the moment it's just a project of myself and John only. And we are going to be reviewing a series of documentaries related to, I would probably say, mainly dinosaurs at the moment. We might probably expand it to other ones like Permian, Cenozoic, like Paleozoic, basically, Cenozoic as well, perhaps. But mostly we're gonna be focused on dinosaurs, so that will be the priority. And the first show we wanted to do is what I call a bit of an underdog in comparison, because it was made roughly in a very close proximity in the time period when Walking with Dinosaurs was really big. And even though it was, I think, made afterwards, but it still was kind of in the hype anyway, so it kind of was slightly in the shadows of that show. So I thought we would start with that and give some love to the underdog, if you will. And we'll just do it episode by episode. And generally what we will do is we will go through our notes just bit by bit, establish what the show is telling us, and compare the consistencies. And generally the standards that we're going to be using is we're going to be using the actual dictionary definitions of what a documentary is, which I will quickly just bring up here in just a few seconds. You should see it right here. So you can see the one, it's a bit of a collage. So the one on the top, what dictionary did you use for that one, John? Remind me, please.
I use the Merriam-Webster definition.
Okay, and the one below it you will see, that's with a number pointer too, because I just forgot to cut that out for some reason and I didn't notice it, but who cares. And yes, this is basically the Oxford Dictionary. So as you can see, we took a sample of two, and you generally see there's a consistent point about it, that it's basically supposed to actually show you certain factual events and using some kind of evidence for it as well. So in other words, it's not supposed to be a fiction per se, it's more it's actually supposed to tell you a story based on actual factual events as accurately as possible. And of course context is important, which is what we're going to establish, that of course we are basing this on what we could find ourselves. That doesn't mean it's an end all and be all, so for anyone who gets overly hissy in the comments, I mean, you're of course welcome to do so. As you can tell, I don't mind that at all, but I do, however, ask to pay close attention to what we're saying before, of course, you jump into quick, premature conclusions. Just a humble request on my side. Is there anything in terms of context that you would like to add, John, or are we happy to go ahead with our first part of this show?
I do have a couple things I think are worth mentioning.
Yeah.
For this series that we're going to be doing, our main focus, like Arsene pretty much said, is we're going to be focusing on the actual scientific content within the documentary itself. We're not going to be focusing on the quality of the CGI, and we may reference it a couple times, but it's not going to be a major focus. We're not going to talk about the quality of narration. We're not going to talk about the music. We're not going to talk about our subjective emotional reactions to this, because personally, I think a lot of times documentaries are often praised for their visuals and their and what kind of reaction they get out of us. And don't get me wrong, that is a perfectly understandable thing to praise and such. But ultimately, at the end of the day, a documentary is meant to be a tool of education. It's meant to show and educate others on as factual of events or individuals as possible, whether that's a historical documentary on World War I or World War II, or it's in this case a dinosaur documentary. And so, and I'll be the first to admit, I love when dinosaurs roamed America, but I am going to really try and rein in whatever biases I may have, because at the end of the day, this is going to be an objective critique of sorts of a documentary and how well it really holds up and stands to the test of time. Not me just gushing about how, oh, the music made me feel this way, or I felt this because of a certain storyline. And I think that's just important to keep in mind, because that is what the main focus of the documentary is. That's the main focus of our series is going to be. And I think that's probably going to be the best way to figure out what we should be looking for in a documentary from here on out, when future ones come out. So, but that's most of what I had to say. And whenever you're ready, I'm free to start.
I also wanted to add, now that you mention it, that even though we did pretty much compare and went over our notes about what we're planning to bring up, there may even be times when we might bring up points where we might actually even challenge each other, in case we happen to have, slightly different views on the same issue. So just because, we're from the same crew doesn't mean that our opinions are unilateral and copy and paste copycats of one another, if you will. We do have diversity of opinions and thoughts here, quite enough of it, in fact, that sometimes it gets a bit overwhelming, and I'm pretty sure you know what I mean by that. So
Yep.
Especially when you finish your 10-hour shift at work, and then you go into Discord for whatever reason, you decide to go there before you go to bed, and you see a whole stream of 50 plus unread messages in a certain thread, and you're like, okay, I'll read that tomorrow morning, I just can't be asked with it right now. But in any case, let's jump right in. So welcome to the first episode of When Dinosaurs Roamed America, and I think they do open up mainly, as I would probably say, naturally and logically expected, with the Permian Extinction. Is that right? So shall I maybe bring this slide, and I'd like you to talk about this one here, John. It's the segment 1, Late Triassic Permian Mass Extinction. So what did the show actually say And what did you discover in regards to how consistent did you feel it was?
So when dinosaurs roamed America has a bit of a love for meteorite strikes for extinction events, and this is the first of three that they show for extinction events that are due to a meteorite strike. And they say that about 250 million years ago, an asteroid impact caused the Permian mass extinction. Now, this is, first of all, just to be super technical, the Permian mass extinction technically happened about 252 million years ago. By 250 million years ago, that was when the Triassic already started, to the best of my knowledge, anyway. And the extinction event was sort of in its last few years at best. It wasn't like it happened directly at 250 million years ago. But that aside, the main focus of this section is that the meteorite, there is no, as far as I can find, there's no honest evidence to support that there was a meteorite strike at about 252 million years ago to cause the Permian mass extinction. Now, like most mass extinctions, or at least several mass extinctions, the Permian one is not a very clear-cut extinction event where it's like, okay, there's this one thing that caused everything to go to hell in a handbasket. It's not like the KPG mass extinction that killed off the dinosaurs, where we can say it was a meteorite. This one, even though we have a lot of evidence to support that that extreme volcanism at the Siberian traps was probably the most significant part of the extinction event, it's one of those this extinction event. You have a general increase in aridity throughout Pangea. You have the volcanism in the Siberian traps as well. You
I'm
also
sorry.
have.
I'm sorry. Just a moment, please. Just quickly, could you backtrack a couple seconds before that, because the recording lagged out for some reason and it didn't pick up anything you said. It was like a brief cut bit. So can you just go back to the beginning of this point, just for a moment for me, please? Thank you.
Okay, sure. So basically, the documentary implies, or actually pretty much states, that the Permian mass extinction was caused by a meteorite strike. There is no evidence to support that there was a meteorite strike around that time, and as of right now, the Permian mass extinction seems to be a bit of a hodgepodge of events happening, the most significant of which being the Siberian traps, volcanism at the Siberian traps. But it's a very complicated situation, given that there seems to be some evidence that uh, even before the actual extinction event 252 million years ago, there was already volcanism going on at the end of the Middle Permian that helped cause a bit of a biodiversity drop. And as a result of that, life was already sort of in a bit of a weird place during that time. And so it seems to be more of a combination of factors, with volcanism being the most severe of these factors. But at no point have I found anything that suggests that there was a meteorite strike. We haven't found a location for a crater or anything that would indicate where exactly this meteorite would have hit. And as a result, the documentary sort of uses this as a bit of a easy to go to explanation for what happened, whereas it seems to be, from what I found, the Permian mass extinction is a bit more complicated than that.
Right. Well, I think that establishes that part pretty well. So, and again, I mean, very good criticism in my opinion. Of course, if anybody would have anything to say to that, if they have anything to add or challenge here, I think we shall say we'll be looking for you in the comments section down below, and maybe it might shine a bit of a better light. And if there's something that is actually very well good that we may have missed out about that particular part, if it's of particular prominence here in this case, then who knows, maybe I might pin it. So now shall we go to our next slide? And I believe this one is going to be our setting of the place. So it's the setting of Newark Supergroup, Locaton formation. So let me open this slide up so that I have it for us here ready on the screen. Here we go. So it's a very interesting choice that of a place that they've made, and I would say it does appear to be quite a bit of a hodgepodge of things, because I mean, the show, if I remember correctly, and you marked it on the screen as well, as I can see on the right hand side, the time chart, you know, the time bar, it's marked with a sort of wide reddish line, and that's 220 million years ago is what they are establishing. So as you can see on the left hand side, that's where the screen from the documentary actually tells us that it's in New York 220 million years ago. Now what is interesting is that, of course, we will get into it in more detail, but yes, there's a lot of crazy inconsistencies happening here, and when we establish them, we will maybe then see if we could come up with some of our own ideas, what we think would have been a good alternative way to present and make it, you know, a good point to make it across, but at the same time actually making it more accurate to what it was supposed to be. But do you have any thoughts on this particular screen and image about about the Newark Supergroup, or is that just going to be our opening into the next section?
I have a couple thoughts that I'd like to share.
All right.
On the far right of the slide, I have added a map that details the entirety of the Newark Supergroup. And the reason why I specify the Newark Supergroup is because that's what the documentary talks about, and they reference that it was a series of lakes, which, as far as I can tell, that is still accurate. That is still something that the Newark Supergroup is currently interpreted as a rather subtropical, lacustrine environment that was that a series of lakes were throughout the entirety of the area during the Triassic. And if you can see the little star by where New Jersey, in the northern part of where New Jersey is, that is where I selected. It might be a little off, but where I tried putting where the Locaton Formation is, because even though it's set in New York, the formation itself actually encompasses New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And even though they don't specify that it's from the Locaton Formation in the documentary, I chose this formation because and we'll get into them more, but two of the animals that are shown are both known from the formation itself. And that might be why, I'm not going to try and make too many assumptions here, but that might be why the creators decided to go with the Locaton Formation. But as we will talk about further, there is quite a lot of anachronisms and some weird animals in the formation that don't really fit at all with in the Locaton, or really anywhere in the Newark Supergroup. So, but I wanted to get that out of the way because there's some specifics I wanted to just lay out for this for the location that they provided here. So
sure. And I mean, obviously the reason why I even entrusted you to do this type of slides and presentations is because you are very good at navigating these kind of things. I am very good at, let's just say, slightly different things that I am avoiding to specify, because when I start thinking about it, I'm kind of struggling to think what am I actually good at. But joking aside, though, I do want to say that indeed, as a disclaimer maybe, and a bit of a minor spoiler, that these kind of anachronistic-ish, maybe slight, inconsistencies, they get better, I think, as the episodes go further down in the show towards the end. So they get it better later. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean it's not without problems still, which eventually we will get there. But since it's the first episode, we will just focus on the first episode. Now, are we ready to jump into our first creature?
Yeah, I'm down. I'm game.
I say let's go with it. So, and the first one that we have here is the very well known Coelophysis, and as far as I know, the American species. So if the second species, which is I believe African species, is valid, but the first one, this one here anyway, is an American species, Coelophysis boweri, right?
Yep. I like to call it Coelophysis boweri, but
or boweri,
whatever,
yeah,
whatever.
I'm not sure
Yep.
actually, because obviously sometimes I'm pronouncing them more like as it reads in Latin, which would be boweri or something like that, but people get the point anyway. So
Yeah.
now, quick few things on my end in regards to, and of course you put up the image much nicer than the one I took a screenshot of, because, well, it just looks prettier, to be honest, than what I have been able to produce, so I'm just not even gonna show what I've done. But it's very nicely, look at, my personal thing that I have about it is that I like that the coloration choice in this particular shot, at least, it comes off very nicely because it fits the environment. But in the other instances, of course, you will find that the colors just come off a little bit too unnatural, even for the hues that they have picked. So I would probably say, if it was my choice, I would have maybe just a tiny bit reduced the saturation. But then, of course, we have other good points. There is no visible fenestre on the snout that I can see, at least. It might be there, but they might have just tricked us with the visual and we are just not noticing it. But as far as I can tell, it's not obvious to the point where I can see it. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not really there. Of course, the nostril orientation issue, that's another thing that obviously is subject to a lot of different discussions, but generally speaking, it does seem to be facing kind of sideways-ish. Although I would probably argue that maybe it could have been a bit more diagonally forwards while being sideways at the same time. But of course, another good example here is that there is no lips, quote unquote, because as far as I'm concerned, there is absolutely no evidence or justification to put these kind of structures on any archosauromorph, not just dinosaurs, unless, of course, you have evidence to support it. As much as people like to cry that that's somewhat of a condition that is default for whatever reason. They decided that it's a default condition for all tetrapods, but nobody seems to be able to actually support that case whenever it comes down with scrutiny. So I'd say that from, as far as I'm concerned, that part is accurately depicted. And the only thing I cannot see is the ear placement. That's another tricky one that, normally we place it behind, the top area of the skull, as of the way they do it now. But here in this image, it's just not obvious. I cannot tell if it's in the jawline, which is not where I would do it. And as I said, though, it's a very tricky one, so I'm not gonna really make any judgments on that at the moment. But if it were up to me, I would have placed it sort of, if you were to draw a bit of a straight line behind the eye and keep going all the way until the skull, back of the skull basically, and somewhere around there maybe. That's where I would have probably placed it. Now let's get to the skeletal of it. As you can see, you have included it, which I believe is Scott Hartman's skeletal drawing.
I think so, yeah.
Give me a second, please. I'm gonna pause. Alright, guys. Sorry, that was I had to step away briefly, so just wanted to quickly get back to the point that I was bringing up. And John, did you get the skeletal from Scott Hartman's website? Is that the one?
I believe so, yes. So what I did with finding skeletals where I could, or actual physical skeletons in museums, and so as well as the artwork that you see up top there, was to try and compare what more recent depictions of Coelophysis to that of the documentary. And I personally think, based on what I'm seeing here, looking at the documentary and what I found, the Coelophysis looks pretty solid. It seems to hold up pretty well. I think the neck could be just shortened just a tad. Uh, again, I'm just eyeballing this a little bit, so you can tell me if I'm off base or not. But I think the neck on in the documentary could be shortened a little bit, and maybe the head, at least in the shot that I have, up top there, makes it look like the head is a little bit more proportional to the neck, where in the skeletal, the head is noticeably fairly big. But again, that's just my observations, and you are free to let me know if I'm off base. But other than that, I guess the other big thing too is that I think all three of these, as a matter of fact, all three of these depictions have the Coelophysis have pronated hands, which obviously is a bit of a mistake that was made way back when, and that's kind of a bit of an amusing thing. But other than that, I think it holds up pretty well, I'd say.
I also wanted to point out, and in case I forgot to establish it, which I should have actually done, but for some reason I may have missed it. But if I haven't, then of course not to worry. But if I have missed that part, we are reviewing this based on, not on how it was done at the time and based on what was known at the time. We are reviewing it from the lens of from the perspective of if this was to come out as it is in at the time of making this video, how well does it hold up? That's basically the idea here, and that's the lens we're gonna be using in order to make our reviews. That's what we're basing it on. That's our metric, if you will, and
Yep.
what we're doing, rather than trying to see what was known at the time when it was being made. We're actually trying to see how well it holds up after all these years, if it were to come out exactly as it is, as we see it, but in at the time of us making this video. And I will make another quick observation on the feet. If you notice the CGI image on the left hand side, it actually makes the feet and legs look a tad bit too big and chunky in comparison to the other ones, which is obviously where you start seeing and noticing the proportions slightly going a bit off in that sense. When the head starts looking a bit smaller, the neck starts looking a bit smaller as well in comparison, and the same with the tail and everything else. And I think if they were to make slightly neater looking, like, legs and feet, that would more so feet than legs, by the way, because I think legs actually are okay. It's just the feet, the lower parts, like the ankles and below, if you will, like that sort of area on the shins and the feet itself, digits and stuff like that. Those came out a bit too thick, but that is only a minor detail, I suppose.
I wonder. I'm just curious. I think this shot was, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think this shot was taken while it was in movement, so that might be why the foot looks a little wacky there, because it's in the process. Like, it's in the model itself is in the process of moving, because this is where it failed to catch the Icarosaurus and it decides to walk away. Spoiler alert.
Yes, spoiler alert. There will be some more of that.
But that could be why it looks so funky. But otherwise, yeah, the feet look a little bit big compared to what the feet look like in the skeletal and the artwork on the slide.
Well, now that we have, I think more or less we have established where we are on the phenotype of Coelophysis, and if I'm correct, generally, despite few minor details, which really weren't that many anyway, we're actually quite happy with this design, at least based on what we know and see. I'm personally convinced that that's a Coelophysis, despite many minor maybe things. I'm quite convinced that it's a Coelophysis.
Yep.
Now, there is another problem, however, and that is where the bigger problem comes in, that based on the place and time period that they have specified, which is New York, Triassic of 220 million years ago, that's a completely anachronistic move that they've done, because Coelophysis did not actually appear in a record, at least according to what I have found, not until 204 million years ago, and it went extinct at 201.6 million years ago, roughly, give or take. And the other problem is that Coelophysis bauri or bauri, depends on how you obviously read it, is of Arizona and New Mexico, as far as America is concerned. It is not anywhere near New York or New Jersey, or just as you correctly pointed out, the Newark group, which is being the centerpiece in terms of the location and environment. So that's a very obvious and pretty crude anachronistic mistake here that they've made, which is very interesting, considering that once we get to the next creatures, let's actually go to the next creature, because that might be a good way to give a transition to what would be next, and that is the one I'm opening up right now. The slide is the Rutiodon, and you I believe went with whatever they listed in the Wikipedia. No, well, technically it's a wiki, yeah. So it's a carolinensis or carolinensis, depends on how you pronounce it. It's one of the two species. The other one is manhattanensis, which is named in fact after New York. So I thought that it could be either one, because actually they were not that far off each other, if I'm correct, in terms of locality. But
yeah, probably not. I'm basing the species name off of the Lucatong Formation page on Wikipedia, which reads as Rutiodon carolinensis. So
yeah, that means that basically maybe there was another formation where the manhattanensis was discovered, which probably, if we were to dig a bit more, we would probably find that it's not that far from that location as well.
Probably not, no.
Yeah. But the whole point is that this is now where we start looking at the anachronistic point. So while Rutiodon itself, in terms of the time and place, it's not very far off. In fact, it falls within the 220 million years quite easily, because it's given the estimate of 237 all the way to 208.5, give or take, million years ago. So of course 220 time period fits very safely within that margin. Now what we also note that yes, it is, I believe, is that New Jersey? Well, I mean, it does probably encompass New Jersey and New York, as you said, the formation itself does anyway. And it's quite fair, to say that they got this part at least correct with this creature. But there's one part that is completely incorrect, and that is the fact that nor based on the time period or the location, in fact, that and the location, it would have never met Coelophysis. So they would have been completely like basically if when Coelophysis came around, it would have never had any clue that Rutiodon even existed.
Right, because Coelophysis was in the southwest and Rutiodon is only known from the northeast.
And because it went extinct long before
that too, yeah.
Coelophysis first appeared, in the record at least.
If I may interject something real quick,
Go
because
for
I
it.
feel like there seems to be an argument that I can just see coming up in favor of, well, here's why the anachronism isn't as bad, and that's because during the Triassic Pangea was still a thing. And in theory, and bear in mind I'm saying in theory, someone could argue that Coelophysis could have traveled. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Coelophysis was around 220 million years ago. That's in theory, Coelophysis could have made its way from the southwestern United States to the northeast United States. And there might have been a time that I would have been a bit more receptive of that argument, but number one, the east coast of North America is, when it comes to dinosaurs, it's very poor, very much not as rich as the western half of North America, in part due to soil conditions and the general geology of the area. So when you look at places like the Newark Supergroup and the formations within, their fossil content is nowhere near as rich as it is on the western coast of North America. So if we don't have the evidence to support that Coelophysis boweri lived on the East Coast to begin with, we could have had a Coelophysis looking, an animal that looked like Coelophysis on the East Coast, but we don't have any evidence to support that it would have been Coelophysis itself, or necessarily a direct relative of Coelophysis. So that's the first counterpoint I would make to that argument. And the second one is that, it might depend on the species itself, but from what I've can find about dinosaurs themselves, they're not, species and genre are not particularly widespread. They typically tend to be very localized within a couple states here or there, or one or two provinces, depending on what you're talking about. You don't really find too many dinosaurs that are just on one side of a continent and then another side of the continent. They tend to be very localized in certain areas. And obviously this is a point of discussion that I'd like to get into maybe another time, but based on that, it makes it very hard for me to justify putting Coelophysis on the East Coast, given that it sort of seems like Coelophysis was just reserved in the Southwest. We don't find it in the Northwest or even in the Southeast or anywhere else. It's only known from New Mexico and Arizona. And we know that it seems to be a very common dinosaur down there based on the number of specimens that we have found of Coelophysis, but only in that area. So if we're not finding it in other parts of North America that are very fossil rich, it's very hard for me to reconcile putting Coelophysis on the East Coast, which is much further away than, say, putting Coelophysis in Texas, for example. So I thought I'd bring that up because I know that's an argument that I can imagine coming up in terms of defending the anachronisms in this segment.
Okay, well, I mean, I agree with that as well, because this is something that I thought of, but I haven't actually written this down, but it later occurred to me, and I'm glad that you brought up the point of how concentrated the population of Coelophysis specimens is in that region. And the other thing that's very interesting and maybe worth noting, that southwest, right? It was in southwest region of USA. That's not a small place itself if you were to even just isolate southwest on its own. Right. That is by far not a small place at all. So it's quite interesting that all of these Coelophysis specimens are all localized and confined to that area. So there must have been something that, at least according to what we know now, prevented them from traveling all the way there. But of course, in order for that to be correct, for what the show is showing, it would have had to have been around since 220 million years at least, or whatever it is. Maybe not 220, but let's say at least 208 or so, or 210 maybe million years ago, in order to actually meet Rutiodon, and it would have had to have traveled all the way to that area. So it's quite a bit of conditions that need to be met in order for this to actually hold any true. But we're not done yet, because that's only just these two. We're going to go to the next creature now. The next one on the list here is Desmatosuchus. Now, you know that I have a very special place in my heart, alongside with the big theropod carnivores. The second group that has always been my favorite in general. It's just something that wears a lot of armor. And Desmatosuchus, while it's not a dinosaur, it's still a pretty funky and cool looking animal, and it generally represents the group of animals that I think are very interesting in the way they look overall. And they are not given nearly enough attention, as far as I can tell, in regards to all of that. So as far as Triassic goes, that's definitely one of my most probably fascinating number ones, if you will, among the top numbers, if you will, in terms of which one I like. And they also, funnily enough, they mispronounce it. The narrator mispronounces it as Desmatosuchus, which is quite funny to me. So
yes.
I've noticed that as well.
Yes, that's why I added it in there because it's obviously I like John Goodman's narration, but it's kind of funny when he gets things wrong, and this is one of those times where it's like and he's close because you just have to move the S to between the E and the M, and then you got it right. But for whatever reason, um, it came out as Desmatosuchus. So
Yeah, he does have this very interesting thing. I've noticed that straight away when I was watching the episodes that he was completely mispronouncing. I was like, is he doing it on purpose or does he legit maybe not realizing that it's not the correct, you know?
I actually have as far as I can tell, I have some insight into what was going on as to why he mispronounces some of the names. Apparently, John Goodman was going back and forth between recording sessions of when dinosaurs roamed America, and as well, and then also going to either doing a Broadway production or some kind of other acting gig, and he was going back and forth, and he was very it was very time consuming, very tedious. He was very busy, and as a result he ended up saying some of the names wrong, and the guys were telling him, John, it's Desmatosuchus, and at some point he was just so frustrated that eventually they just said, you know what, we'll just go with the pronunciations that he says because he was just so uh I'm losing the word here, but he was just so frustrated with having these two things going on at the same time that they decided to just give in and go with Demastasuchus instead of Desmatosuchus, as well as maybe a couple others. I'm not entirely sure, but that is as far as I can tell the main reason why they stuck with these pronunciations.
I find it very funny, nevertheless. It's a bit of a meme, like, okay, shall we just let him do it, because otherwise he might just walk away on us, and then we'll be
Yeah,
kind of having a bit of a problem looking for another narrator, and then that's gonna raise a few eyebrows in terms of why there are multiple narrators, if they
right.
were to kind of, try to save time rather than re-record the whole thing altogether.
Right.
So
It certainly doesn't help that the documentary was sort of on a bit of a time constraint because Discovery wanted it to be out by Jurassic Park 3's release. So they were crunching a bit. Um, that might also explain why the CGI is not as refined in some areas as it could be. Um, but yeah, it wasn't like a production hell or anything like that, but it was certainly um, it was a little interesting. I'll just say that from what I've heard.
sure. Well, let's comment on this Demastasuchus then, shall we?
Sure.
So, I mean, obviously, I am comparing the images. Of course, they are at a bit of an angle, so it can be potentially slightly skewed there and then. As a whole, it seems to me that it's a fairly reasonable interpretation as far as the show goes. It's showing off the necessary features that are defining characteristics of the creatures, so I'm happy with that in general. It seems like they're not really missing anything that I can think of, at least on the first glimpse. And then, of course, the main part that, of course, I'm particularly concerned with, and this is another one of those things that is, it's less anachronistic in terms of the time period, because this Matasuchus does fit within the 220 time period, because it was around approximately 228 to 210 million years ago. But they have completely, of course, decided to teleport it into New York, or Newark group, if you will, from
Yep.
Texas, maybe New Mexico and Arizona, which is basically where Coelophysis was. However, of course, as we already established, they've never met, these two creatures. Coelophysis and Desmatosuchus never met each other. Even though the locality, in terms of the place itself, it's actually correct. So the most we can probably think of that Coelophysis might have seen a couple skeletons there and then, potentially, or maybe like some resurfaced fossils of some of these critters, and what was probably wondering what the hell they are, if it was anyway concerned at all. But could have potentially taken a dump on some of them too, who knows, but or maybe drunk the blood of his rivals from their skulls, but for all intents and purposes, these creatures were not alive at the same time. That is the underlying point, so that's another anachronism, kind of misalignment here. And do you have anything else to add about the Desmatosuchus, or shall we move to the next creature?
I do have one. The reason why I have a picture of it about to swing at the Coelophysis there is because, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken here, but I'm looking at that Coelophysis and I'm comparing to the Desmatosuchus, and if you eyeball it with the Desmatosuchus art piece to the right, you notice that the Coelophysis would look very, 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 very small. Well, maybe not that many varies, but it would be much smaller than I believe Coelophysis actually was in terms of size. Obviously, it's a visual of how diminutive dinosaurs were at that time, or at least some dinosaurs were at that time, compared to other archosauromorphs. But even then, the Coelophysis, either the Desmatosuchus is too big, which I don't think it is, or the Coelophysis is too small. Because when you see that tail fling at it, and the Coelophysis dodges it, obviously, it's just interesting because if I'm comparing this to the artwork here, the Coelophysis would be very small, and I don't think Coelophysis was that small compared to Desmatosuchus. So that's the reason why.
Yeah, of course. Because I mean. Even though in terms of mass, it's obviously much lighter than this Desmatosuchus for obvious points that you can can see right there. It's obvious why, but it's not quite exactly dwarfed in terms of dimensions wise.
No.
Not that necessarily it would even try its luck anyway with something like that. We will of course get to some of the portrayals later, once we go over certain things. But yes, in terms of the appearance, spot on, more or less, all things considered. But as far as the time period and location is concerned, well, time period, I would say that's a tick, that's a pass, green tick. But the location, that's a red cross right there. So now let's go to the next creature on our list here for this episode, and that creature is Icarosaurus. Now,
so this is the you can go if you want.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think is gonna be probably, well, for one, I am not sure, I haven't been able to, quickly at hand find specific, time period that, oh wait, sorry, ignore me there, that's something else that I was trying to refer to. That was a bit of my mistake. It does seem to, it appears that at least based on the general information that I was able to recover on the Icarosaurus of this species. And yes, it did come from that area, from Newark group.
Yep.
It came at the time period, which fits within 220 million years ago, which fits there quite nicely, in fact. About the same, basically, time as Rutiodon, give or take a few million years back and forth. But they did coexist in the same place and the same time period. These two would have. Now,
and these two are the only these two are the only animals in the entire segment that are from the Lockatong Formation. So Rutiodon and Icarosaurus. Those are the two that I entertained before. So
exactly, and that is why I think it's important to point out that this is the only time when you can see that they've scored it correctly by putting these two together. That was the correct choice of creatures to show. And as far as the accuracy goes, I'm not particularly great at these type of creatures. I don't know them all that well. All I can say is that I'm just going to say and trust that they have portrayed it correctly, as far as I can tell, in the sense that those I think at least the images that we see both in the film and the one that you have provided are showing that it's got these ribs that are extending, that can basically unfold and create the sort of glider structure that allows it to, well, literally glide.
Yeah. I will say the documentary does not give too many good angles to really compare Icarosaurus to the fossil or other artistic depictions. So we don't really get to see a good shot of it flying, but we do have, and then also this is the best I could find for a fossil of Icarosaurus. I couldn't really find too many skeletal reconstructions of it that would have fit nicely with comparing it to the documentary. So this was probably the hardest one for me to find images for, and ultimately I went with these because just it's a bit of a um, comparing those few shots, those momentary shots of it flying, to the artwork, and then looking at the fossils to say that okay, this thing actually had, well, by flying I mean gliding, actually had ribs that could extend out to allow it to do this in the first place. Um, but that's what I've got for the photos at the moment.
Okay, so with that in mind, I suppose, do you have anything to specifically add to Icarosaurus, considering how limited, obviously, its appearance was, or have you got anything that you've noticed about it specifically that was worth mentioning for the purpose of this show?
Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot I can say given its very limited appearance. There was a really amusing scene where it just sort of walks along a beach, just as the Coelophysis approaches the lake to drink, right before the Rutiodon tries to ambush it. I just find it amusing because here's this animal that probably was spending most of its time in the trees flying around, and here it is just walking around the beach. Not really a complaint, just kind of amusing.
I suppose, yeah. It does. I think this show does sometimes make those small scenes that look just a tad bit amusing to watch, but
Yeah.
but not necessarily it's a bad thing in any way or shape or form. So, um, now let's go to the final creature of this episode, and then we will start going. Well, I mean, you could say final, but not maybe quite final, because there are more. There is more of it there, but it's. Hold on a second. Which one it was? Which one was it? Yeah.
Traversodont.
Yes, I was gonna say this is the one, Traversodont, and then we've got some other cameos, Eastern Qual cameos that
Yep.
you've mentioned. But an interesting part, of course, is, well, I mean, I cannot attest to the accuracy of the portrayal of the creature itself. The only thing I can attest to is the fact that, as far as we know, the creature actually comes from South America.
Yes. Yes. This is another one where it's like very limited, probably there to be for like, I guess you could call it world building, to show that these were some of, like, sort of like with the Icarosaurus. The Traversodont sort of serves as an animal to highlight the variety of creatures during the Triassic. It's a neat appearance, but Traversodonts themselves were from South America, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't a whole lot of. I don't think there's any confirmed cynodonts from the late Triassic in North America, to my knowledge. There's material that's been designated to cynodonts, but nothing that has been, no described species or genre yet. And just to make it clear, Traversodonts are a member or members of the cynodont family, so it's very limited. I'm not even sure what the you'd have to look really closely because its whole body's in motion, and it's very hard to get a good look at it to know how accurate it is compared to what the real animal was like. Um, but overall, they say it lived in burrows, which, I mean, it's not out of the realm of. I know we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. But ultimately, it's just a cameo. It's a cameo of a mammal like reptile. Um, And then the reason why I lumped in the eastern quoll in there is because very early on, there's a shot of the Coelophysis coming down a hill, and there's this little mammal that just decides to go into a burrow, and then the Coelophysis decides to attack it. Obviously, we don't see the quoll get killed, which is nice, but it's kind of amusing because here is a more advanced mammal, like an actual mammal, not just a basal synapsid or a mammal-like reptile, and here it is wandering around in what is supposed to be the Triassic. Now, I believe the reason why they have this in is because um, the segment was filmed in Tasmania, so that would explain why the quoll appears in the first place. And I can only assume they put the scene in here because someone took a shot of the quoll and they decided to uh, make it out to be that the Coelophysis attacks and kills the animal itself. Now, obviously, if we are going to be scientific about this, the best the quoll could possibly be is a um, basal synapsid of some sort. But obviously, it doesn't look like a basal synapsid. It's not a basal synapsid, and it's just kind of there because it was filmed in Tasmania. That's really the best explanation I've got for why they have it in there.
So you could probably just say this was an attempt to troll the audience in a way, potentially. Like if you've noticed
Maybe.
it, it's like if you've noticed it, great. If you haven't, well, I guess, well, whatever, you know. We'll just pretend like it didn't happen. So, uh, all right. Well, in this case, I believe there is another slide um, that we have remaining here. Let me see if... Well, I mean, obviously there is the mass extinction, but I am thinking that instead of mass extinction first, I would like to go over some points on some of the claims that were being made, and then we can
Sure.
wrap it up with the Triassic mass extinction.
Sure.
So, one of the points I have on my notes, and this is obviously me being me, and that's part of what I do on my channel and on my shows, is that I try to be nitpicky to see how well various items of and subjects, let's just say, of my criticisms can hold up to these different nitpicky points that I bring up. And I can probably say, in case the people who are new to the channel are watching this, I might not be the worst, you know, in that sense. There are few people from my crew who I think could do a much better and crazier, let's just say, takes on the nitpicking as far as that's concerned, you know, but like Jeffrey and possibly even a few other people there and then. But in any case, my first one was the Coelophysis being characterized as curious. Now, this is something that is quite interesting. The way they brought it up is obviously there is a specific quote with it, which I don't remember itself, but one of the things when they were characterizing it was as curious. And while it is possible, due to the curiosity just generally being a common behavioral trait and pattern across animal kingdom, there is actually no way to test and prove this claim when referring to extinct taxa. And I was just kind of finding it fascinating how they just went with this idea without even actually, you know, without even probably even thinking, can we actually verify whether or not this type of creature would have been curious, as they claim, or whether or not it would have been a lot more kind of passive and only acted on its basic instincts when it was really urged to, if you will, but rather, other than that, would have been, I would probably dare say, rather introverted and secluded, but who knows. My point is that obviously it's not that it's wrong to say that it was curious, it's just very interesting of how would one be able to even verify something like that, because behavior in general is extremely difficult to test and prove. In some cases it's possible to generate hypotheses, but I think in terms of if the curiosity is going to be determined the criteria, it makes it really difficult to actually test something like that, which is not necessarily a criticism per se for the documentary of claiming or at least presenting it as curious. It's just that the fact that they brought it up got me thinking about that. That's what I'm trying to say here.
Right. I think for me, the curiosity line, it's sort of a tough. I think for me, it's a tough call in this case because I don't think it's does any damage per se, but it does ask, did they put it in there because, well, they looked at Coelophysis and interpreted it as a potentially curious creature. And I think the best way to sort of have the best of both worlds is to take out that line, replace it with something else, and then sort of show Coelophysis as being curious. Because we have a fair few scenes where we obviously see Coelophysis as a very curious animal, and I think that comes across very well just through visuals, not so much through the dialogue. Kind of feels a little put in there because they needed some narration in that. But obviously, if the idea was we need to make Coelophysis look like a curious animal, it does a pretty solid job of displaying that. So I'd say to mediate what you're talking about here, I would replace that line with something else. And I understand that the full quote, is supposed to show how Coelophysis as a dinosaur is very different from the other reptiles of its age, but I think you could word it in a way that doesn't sort of beg those kinds of questions. Um, but again, I don't think it's super harmful, but obviously, I think if we were to find a way to sort of word that better or integrate it better, I think there are ways to do it.
Yeah, and I agree with this as well. I'm just kind of thinking that, if that were more, if there was more of a focus on showing versus telling, if you've noticed it, great. Again, it's one of those things. If you would have noticed it, that they are portraying it as that kind of curious creature, that's one thing. But then if you haven't noticed, that's okay too. You just enjoy the show and go with it. And potentially it's like a rewatch, sort of replay, if you will, value, where you can rewatch it and try to notice details that you may have missed, when you watched it for the first time. Once you've gotten used to everything else and you're starting to see if you can find any other little details there that you might have not seen at first. And I think this would have been one of those things that could have been very nice to have that to sort of subtle message, to see if the visual cues are actually gonna land and resonate, or whether it's gonna be falling flat. And if it does fall flat, then of course it gives you a good food for thought about why did it do so and why not, so. But I'd say I agree, yeah, that might have been a good way to negate that. Not necessarily because obviously, as you said correctly, in my opinion, it doesn't detract from this and doesn't do any specific kind of damage in the portrayal or misinformation of any kind. What it does do, however, is just make you maybe slightly kind of, some people who are like myself, for example, they will be like, oh, okay, I just heard this word and now I want to kind of start asking these questions, basically like how this, how that, so that's what I'm kind of saying, that it kind of gets me to that point where I'm tempted to start asking these questions. Now, the next thing, of course, we can see is that I think is the praise on my side of things about Coelophysis being portrayed as agile and quick, which I believe is quite consistent with how lean and gracile and overall very well, adapted to this type of behavior and locomotion it was built. So I think that portrayal of it was actually very consistent overall. I mean, of course, it would have definitely been quick enough to respond to any kind of movement from other creatures that were there. I would assume that in most cases, any attempts from all these big hulky predators trying to snatch it would have been mostly unsuccessful, maybe with some rare exceptions, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were mostly unsuccessful because of that very reason. Because that also was one of the things that made it chase after the Icarosaurus, because Icarosaurus was also a very quick and agile creature, and the only animal that can potentially hunt the quick and agile creature is another animal that is very quick and agile naturally. So
Right.
at least it would make most sense and logically consistent. So I thought that was a very interesting thing. And yes, it was entertaining to watch it try to chase the Icarosaurus all the way around. for all I could say. But then, of course, we see now one thing that I wanted to point out about Icarosaurus is that the show actually claims that it was the first reptile who learned how to glide. Now, there's a very important thing to note here that, of course, it's a bit of a vague wording and rhetoric in that sense from the narration as far as the script goes, because it can be interpreted as that this specific taxon was the first one, or it was this reptile was the first one, as in like they're referring to the group itself, which I don't think is likely. I think they were referring to this specific taxon, but that is what I've heard from that rhetoric. At least that's what landed on my end, you know, that's how it landed. And if that is the case, if that's what they actually referred to, then I can, of course, with confidence say that that's a false claim. Actually, it's incorrect. The actual first reptile from the same family, by the way, which is, oh my god, now I'm gonna butcher it. So it's Cuneosauridae. Cuneosauridae, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Cuneosauridae, or Cueniosauridae. My god, my tongue just breaks it. And I'm speaking as somebody who is learning a foreign language, Japanese to be specific. I don't break my tongue nearly as often learning Japanese than I am when I'm trying to pronounce some of these names of these creatures in English. So now the important thing, yes, that there is another taxon from Poland actually, which was described in 2009, which of course would explain why the claim no longer is correct. But as I said, we are looking at it, what if they were to make it as it was exactly, but as of making of this video. And yes, if they were to basically produce it like this, then this claim would have been false and incorrect, because Pamelina polonica was described in 2009, and it falls within the 251.2 to about 247.2 million years range, and it's the oldest member of this family, of these gliders, if you will. So it's not the first. We don't know if Pamelina was in fact the first one that quote-unquote learned how to glide, but we do know that it came before Icarosaurus by quite a long time, in fact. Like, at least as of this, there's at least, 20 million years gap between when Pamelina went extinct and in Poland and when Icarosaurus showed up first in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out there as well. Anything you can add on this, or shall I move to my next point as well?
I am not a huge expert on these animals, so unfortunately I don't have any immediate thoughts on hand about that. So if you want to move on, that's fine. I think it sounds pretty decent at the moment.
Now, here's another thing that I found very interesting. It's when we see Desmatosuchus being portrayed like it was squaring up against both Coelophysis and Rutiodon, of course, in different situations. And it appears to me that it's generally a very nice way that they've showed in this case that it's kind of plausible for predators not to be particularly keen on trying their luck with a more dangerous prey when there is an abundance of other food sources around in their environment, which I thought was a very nice move, that they weren't trying to force, another creature versus creature, like awesome bro kind of scene fight, if you will, with some badass moves, but instead they just basically show that, yeah, they can go into confrontations, but predators tend to have this, genetically instinctive, maybe inbrained memory, perhaps from the ancestors of some kind, or previous generations, that there are certain type of creatures that they should just not try to attack, or even if they do it by trial and error, it kind of, if they manage to survive, they know better already that there's just certain type of prey that is simply not worth it in terms of how much energy and potential risk to their own well-being it might take for this to be taken down. So, and of course, PS here, that Desmatosuchus seems to be the boss, the Chad. So I'm all for
Yeah,
it. I'm all for it. Go
I'm
armor.
down with it.
Yes, definitely. Now,
Um,
of course, that means that, once again, neither of them would have been able to actually end up in the situation because they never lived in the same time period. And in the case of Rutiodon, they also did not live in even the same place. But we've already established that, so I don't think there's any point to go back on it again.
I think something that I picked up on when watching this scene is that if you notice the Rutiodon does not really attempt to actually attack the Desmatosuchus. It almost seems like the Rutiodon is more upset, like it's a territorial thing that, hey, this guy's walking on my property. What are you doing? Because you compare that to when the Rutiodon attempts to attack the Coelophysis, and it's obvious that based from that, it's the hunting strategy that they went with was something similar to a crocodile, where it lies in wait under the water and then springs out to grab onto the prey animal. But in this case, it just walks out of the creek and straight up at the Desmatosuchus, which I find kind of neat, where it's like it doesn't even seem like the Rutiodon wants to eat the Desmatosuchus. It sees it as a intruder, and the Desmatosuchus basically tells him to go pound sand. And then in the case of the Coelophysis, it makes it look as though the Coelophysis is just hopping around. And here you already have this irritated Desmatosuchus, and it gives the impression that the animal is a bit short-tempered. It gives it a bit of personality like that. And obviously there's no way to prove that because Desmatosuchus is extinct, but I can totally believe it's very believable behavior for an animal like that to be very short-tempered and very prone to aggression, especially when it's already been harassed a little bit by a Phytosaur like Rutiodon. So I picked up on those things because it almost seemed like neither of them were even necessarily attempting to hunt the Desmatosuchus. They just so happened to be in its presence, and the Desmatosuchus was putting them in their place, which is quite neat, I think.
I was gonna say that this is one of those cases when it just kind of happened very naturally and organically as a coincidence that you have this curious animal, nevertheless still a predator, in the form of Coelophysis, that already kind of annoyed it enough with its kind of pesky presence. Because to this Desmatosuchus, Coelophysis is, unless there are babies nearby, for example, like hatchlings, Coelophysis is not a threat to it. It's more of a nuisance to it, if anything else. Just like, I'm trying to basically replenish my resources. I'm trying to eat up, you know what I mean? Like, so that I can get myself into shape, and you're basically harassing me here and just basically annoying me with your presence. I just want to be alone, so basically go away kind of attitude. While with Phytosaurs like this one, like Rutiodon, it could potentially pose a minor kind of threat. You could make that case if it wanted to. Not that it would necessarily, but it's still, because it's much bigger, it's already more threatening. But then of course you have that Rutiodon, and you already see that, my god, like, you guys, it's almost like you guys were planning this, together. So, and of course, yes, the fact that this Desmatosuchus just puts them both in their place is kind of something that I feel like more often should be shown, how herbivores, especially when it comes to certain type of armored herbivores, were probably more than capable of putting carnivores back into their place. But it should be done in a very nice and organic way, and I think that was a very nice way to showing it. It wasn't kind of overly embellished or attempting to cater to this kind of surreal, like, awesome bro type of stereotype, if you will, when we want to see things fight because for the sake of looking cool rather than whether or not it's a realistic depiction or not. Because I think this was a very nice way to depict it, as it was able to come out on top in the confrontation, but like a boss, but at the same time it wasn't overly embellished and hyperbolized. Now,
Right.
the next thing I wanted to point out is, this is something maybe you might also add on something, perhaps, is there any evidence of locusts being as big or bigger than basically the head of the Coelophysis being present in this time period and place as well, which is something that quite curious, because we do see a scene of Coelophysis chasing this big locust there, And I'm actually quite curious because I haven't really seen anything that I could make note of that could be prominent. So do we actually know whether or not this was the case, or whether that was just simply inserted for the sake of convenience and storytelling rather than an accurate depiction? In which case it means it would not be accurate if it wasn't actually present there.
So from what I can find, locusts appeared right after the Permian mass extinction. So its appearance in the Triassic is actually really neat because this is the first time we really get to see locusts and grasshoppers appear in the history of life on Earth. And now that being said, uh, the conditions were not ripe for insects that I'm aware of to have grown to the sizes that they were during, say, the Carboniferous period. So, do I think a locust would have been about as big as a Coelophysis' head? Probably not. And I'm unaware of any specific species of locust in the Lockatong Formation. But given that we have an animal that is is significantly more widespread and an animal that um I guess to me it's one of those conditions where it's like I can believe a locust. They don't really give a genus or a species, so it could have just been any kind of locust there. I can believe that locusts were in the Lockatong Formation. They do appear at the end of the or at the beginning of the Triassic. So its appearance, even though it's not based on any hard evidence, is something that I could totally see being a thing. The biggest contention for me is that holy mother of God, that locust is very big. And as far as I'm aware, there is not any locust in the fossil record that gets to be that size.
Exactly, and that's my main point as well. It's not necessarily. I mean, of course, now that you have managed to successfully clear up the point whether or not they appeared, and good on them for including it generally, because as you correctly pointed out, yes, they do seem to appear basically after that Permian extinction, which is basically a very neat touch because it shows, yeah, this is part of the things that might characterize Triassic period as well, that we have these type of animals that are also appearing there for the first time ever. And the only problem is, of course, that it's the size, whether or not they were capable of reaching that size in that time period, which I personally doubt. Even though, that bearing that in mind, that there are some pretty huge locusts around in modern day, in fact, that I have personally come across and even caught in my hands. And those buggers, I can tell you, they have some sharp, rare, they're actual, uh, um, limbs that are the ones that they use for leaping. You know, those ones,
Yeah.
they have a lot of barbs that look
Ooh.
pretty cool, but they are freaking disgusting. If they get you on the skin, they can literally just scratch you to the point where you can actually even start bleeding a little bit. Like it's basically almost an equivalent to a cat scratching you kind of thing. Sometimes, if it's big enough to do that, so you have to be very
Gotcha.
careful. But the point is that yes, they were definitely quite big, probably at least as big as maybe the ones we see today, but not bigger than a Coelophysis skull, though. At least I don't think so.
Yeah,
So
I have no recollection of finding anything about that. So
yeah, and neither do I. So unfortunately, I cannot just say yes or no. But based on the trend, at least that we see, that the only truly big insects of any kind of arthropods of that size, they tend to be more towards much earlier time periods, to be confined to that time frame. That, yeah, that's very unlikely that it got to that size in Triassic. So now, in terms of the final point, let's just go straight to the uh, extinction in the Triassic. So, any, I presume that this is something you have looked into in more detail than I have. So, what would you like to comment on the on what the show was telling us versus what you have actually discovered yourself?
sure. So one of the things that I and this is in part of the this is part of the Triassic mass extinction bit. One of the things I really like about when dinosaurs roamed America is that they'd have segments where they have a paleontologist out in the field and showing us um, physical evidence of where they're getting some of these ideas from. And in this case, I believe it's Dr. Paul Olson. who is pointing to it's a screenshot in the bottom center of the slide where he's pointing to a line of iridium in rocks dated to the Triassic. Now, not many people may know about this, and the documentary brings up once again that a meteorite strike was the main cause of the extinction. But what not many people may realize is that, unlike the Permian extinction shown in the documentary, this one has a bit more credence. The conclusion, I would argue, is still wrong because none of these meteorite strikes happened at the end of the Triassic to be enough to cause a worldwide extinction that is implied from the Triassic mass extinction. But there's definitely evidence to support that there was a series of meteorite strikes that happened during the late Triassic. And one of those, which is in the far right slide, or far right image there, let me see if I can pull it. Okay. It is and I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, the Manicouagan Reservoir in Quebec. This is where a massive crater was formed during the late Triassic. Now, it was radiometrically dated to have been about 13 million years before the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. So this is not enough to say that this was what caused the Triassic mass extinction. But we also see a few more meteorite sites in Ukraine, which they actually bring up in the documentary. They say from Minnesota to Ukraine, one in France. That is also a real impact site. And I think a few in Canada, which they mention in this with this specific site. Again, these are not specified in the documentary as in the sites per se, but they do mention the states and the locations they were found. And yes, we do have these are very real meteorite strikes, but ultimately none of them align well with the end of the Triassic, and none of them seem to be big enough to have caused the Triassic mass extinction. So, while I appreciate and very much admire the documentary's attempts to show us where the evidence comes from for these meteorites, it does not get the conclusion is a bit off base. Now, the Triassic extinction is one of those events that's like the Permian one a bit. It's not very clear as to what exactly happened. We know that around this time Pangea was breaking up, and there was obviously some volcanism going on, but ultimately it's not particularly clear as to what was going on during that time that caused the Triassic mass extinction, and it once again may be the result of a combination of factors acting in tandem that resulted in the deaths of numerous archosauromorphs and other species of animals, and ultimately helped propel the dinosaurs into becoming the dominant life forms on the planet, at least on land anyways. But, again, to this documentary's credit, they do provide a through line by which they can say, this is where we know about these meteorite strikes. But the conclusion at the end of the day is, in my opinion anyways, from what I've seen, incorrect.
Okay, well, I very much appreciate the explanation. It seems you have definitely been busy trying to look up all the relevant evidence, and I'm sure the viewers will appreciate that as well. So, now the other thing I wanted to add is that, as far as you know, is it possible that as, of course, the continent was starting to break up, that means obviously we are experiencing certain shifts in tectonic plates, right? Then
Right.
that will also imply that the water levels in different areas are gonna obviously, we're gonna start seeing water appear in the places where it wasn't before, just as we're gonna start seeing land masses appear in the places where there were not before, for example. And obviously I'm generally speaking without specifically pointing at any specific areas, but that's just generally what happens and can happen quite a lot in this type of scenario. Now, would that be true if I were to say that in this case we're going to experience significant amount of climate change to the point that would affect the vegetation or just an overall, environment and how the air was in terms of to basically make it enough of a contributing factor, not necessarily the decisive factor, but contributing factor, along with many others that we may or may not even know at the moment, that would have also caused certain life forms to start being negatively affected and declining, and thus every other life form that was dependent on it would have also, as a result, started to fall as a domino piece as a result.
So there seems to be some, I don't like to say consensus, but there seems to be some agreement that there seems to be some kind of climate change going on, sea level fluctuations, like you said, as well as potentially pulses, or at least one pulse of oceanic acidification, which all help contribute to causing some very serious ecological imbalances during the Triassic towards the very end. I mean, obviously this has nothing to do with the documentary necessarily, but you look in the Triassic oceans and you notice that ichthyosaurs were a humongous part of the Triassic oceanic ecosystems, and then you go into the Jurassic and you notice that ichthyosaurs, although they still have you still get some very large apex predator types, they steadily start declining in importance and are replaced by plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, and then eventually you get to actually by the time mosasaurs appear, ichthyosaurs are gone. But for a long time in the Triassic, ichthyosaurs were probably one of the most dominant and most important groups of vertebrate marine reptiles in those oceans. And you see that they steadily drop, especially right after the Triassic mass extinction. So we know that something was going on with the oceans, especially. Now on land, it's a little bit hard to decipher what was all going on, but we can tell that phytosaurs, they're gone by the end. Etosaurs like Desmatosuchus are gone. A lot of the very alien groups of reptiles and other animals that appeared right after the Permian mass extinction are utterly wiped out and are replaced by the dinosaurs, by the first true mammals and whatever remains of the cynodonts, and then ancestors to true crocodiles, etc., etc. So I'm not exactly sure of the. Basically, it's again a bit of a combination of factors, and there seems to be, at least like you said, or asked, there seems to be some idea of climate change going on, ocean acidification, sea level fluctuation, that was partially due to Pangea breaking up, and I would argue Pangea breaking up was the most defining factor in causing the mass extinction, but it's still a bit of a hodgepodge of things going on.
You know what would be a very good thought experiment here is try to see if you were to consider every single variable that could come to your mind when it comes to the Triassic mass extinction and start reproducing this scenario, but taking away at least one variable at a time to see whether or not you would still arrive to that conclusion or not, if it's actually even possible to test that way. Because I'm sure I'm not the first one who is smart enough to has come up with this idea. I'm pretty sure many others have already tried it and still are struggling to truly isolate and nail these type of variables. For example, if we were to completely remove the variable of Pangea breaking up, for example, would we still get the same result, all other things considered equal, or are we going to get a completely different result? And if so, would that still be enough to still cause extinction, or would it already be steering the whole let's just say the whole area of events in a completely different direction than when it actually ended up, which is where we enter a bit of a crazy territory of hypothetical scenarios that never happened, and we don't know what could have happened. But I just think that maybe for you viewers as well, maybe do that kind of exercise to see what sort of things you could think of would have happened if you were to start taking away in every scenario, in every version of it, each time take a different variable one at a time away from this whole equation to see if it would affect the conclusion. So,
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because as I've been thinking about this a bit more, it did occur to me that if you look at dinosaurs throughout the Triassic, you do start to notice by the very end that we already get to see the first very fairly large sauropodomorphs like Plateosaurus and those kinds of dinosaurs. Theropods are already getting a bit bigger, maybe not obviously not to the sizes of Allosaurus or Ceratosaurus or Coelophysis per se, but they were definitely getting a bit bigger. And I don't know about anything about like armored dinosaurs or ornithopods per se, but we can definitely see some trends where by the end of the Triassic, dinosaurs were already starting to get fairly big and taking on much more prominent ecological roles, whereas in the past they may have just been second fiddle to a lot of these other archosauromorph groups. And I think the biggest takeaway I can say about the Triassic mass extinction, not to like conclude this discussion by any means, because there's a lot more that needs to go into and a lot more to be studied. But I think my personal takeaway from this is that it wasn't like a this huge it wasn't like a doomsday event like the KPG mass extinction, and it wasn't necessarily a period of time of utter suffering and decay like the Permian mass extinction from what I've seen. It's more of a things were happening, but not but life still seemed to be doing fairly okay, and the animals that would eventually come to inherit the earth were already um preparing for that. It just so happened that during that time there were some things going on with the planet that sort of helped move those groups along ultimately.
well, yes, it's basically just at that point, whatever replaced those other dominant groups of reptiles, which were dinosaurs, who replaced them subsequently, they were kind of just like, waiting a bit like the other smaller civilizations and kingdoms at the time, just waiting for the actual fall of the Roman Empire, just so that once the scraps are around, they can start picking up the scraps and taking up all these niches and spaces that are being left as a vacuum. So I suppose you could make that case as well very easily here, because we do see the fact, based on the statistical evidence at least, we can see that, as you correctly pointed out, dinosaurs were doing quite well, which means that the living conditions for other life forms were actually quite favorable. Because if they weren't, we would not be seeing what we were seeing. So I suppose that's another thing that's fair to point out, that for some reason, basically the other groups previously dominating, they just couldn't bounce back enough to be able to hold on to this power, if you will, to these niches respectively, and they just eventually got displaced, maybe by a variety of different set of circumstances that pushed for that to happen. And of course, as you correctly also said, that it was not happening overnight. It was happening gradually, probably to the point where it would not be even possible to predict or even build up a model, even if you were to live in that time, because predicting things within even the tens and hundreds of years is actually extremely difficult, and modeling these situations is also very difficult, and especially difficult to model the results that it would produce as well, because you simply never know. But imagine trying to do that with millions of years, well, you can probably
Right.
gauge how difficult of a task, if not impossible, it would have been. Now, I think, unless you have something else to add, this concludes my note list on this episode, and I am happy with everything we have covered. But if you have any more notes of your own to add to this segment, then I'm more than happy to give you the microphone over.
I guess I will say this one more thing about the Triassic mass extinction because I find it very fascinating, and it's unfortunate that it's not often discussed as much as it should be. I think in a lot of paleo circles. Um, I remember taking a class in undergraduate where um, we were talking about the five major mass extinctions, and of those five, the Triassic was considered the least devastating of those five. Um, and I believe in the class it was also brought up that some scientists, I don't know who they are, and I don't want to throw any names under the bus, But some scientists have argued that, maybe the Triassic mass extinction wasn't really a mass extinction, but more of a just a case of just a bunch of animals dying out, but not to the same extent as like the Permian mass extinction or the Devonian mass extinction or the Cretaceous or the Ordovician mass extinctions. That this could have just been a usual changing of the guard, but not nearly as devastating as those other ones, which I think definitely is something that we can talk about at another date. But I just thought I'd bring that up because, again, I find this a very fascinating, very fascinating period in Earth's history that doesn't often get talked about, because all we really say about it is, well, it propelled the dinosaurs into world dominance. And yes, it did, but sometimes the specifics behind that are just as important as the conclusions. So that is what I have to say on that. And I guess real quick, I do I personally think the Rutiodon design, because I know we briefly touched upon it, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on the Rutiodon design. I think it looks okay. I feel like the snout doesn't. It looks a little bit too generic. It doesn't give off the Phytosaur. I guess maybe the shot doesn't really help, but I feel like Rutiodon had a bit more of a specific snout compared to like a conventional crocodile, and I don't know. Otherwise, I think it looks okay. I just was curious what your thoughts were on that.
I would say that, of course, if you look at the skeleton that you have included, and I presume that's a skeleton of Carolinensis, or was that a skeleton of the other one, the Manhattanensis, if you remember? Because it might be, because I don't know what the difference between the species are, you see, so that could potentially play a bit of a part in whether or not how I
This is
see
this
this.
is Carolinensis. This is
Carolinensis.
Carolinensis.
Okay. Okay, but in any case, and what about the illustration above that is kind of more in the middle on the white background? Do you know which?
That's also Carolinensis. All the images alongside the documentary one are of Carolinensis.
Okay, in this case, I find it quite interesting, and of course, I don't know how many specimens are actually known, especially the skulls and the snout preservations. But based on this skeleton, if it is reconstructed correctly, it looks like it's got this curve that we do see in Phytosaurs, I think, quite a bit. And that is not really something I've noticed, whether or not they've shown it in the show, because it wasn't always easy for me to see, at least from their, um, from the actual angles, that they were showing it at, whether or not there was that kind of slight curve, of the upper jaw at the tip of the snout.
Yeah, I wasn't seeing much of that curve in what I saw. So, yeah, I'd say that, especially because that's such a notable thing amongst Phytosaurs in general. It just seemed like it was a little bit too generic for me, just the skull. But otherwise, I don't have too many issues with it. I just wanted to bring it up because we briefly touched upon it, but didn't know if we talked about the design and if it looked.
I might
Yeah, okay.
probably say that they might have potentially, in fact, made it a tad bit. And I wouldn't necessarily say overweight, but maybe a bit chunky at the tail, and maybe some other
Yeah,
areas, because I do feel like it doesn't strike me like it would have been quite as massive. Although you never know, because when it comes to archosauromorphs and something that is, as far as the basal creatures like that go, they are, well, they do get very crocodilian looking, if you know what I'm saying here. And
yeah,
among crocodilians, we also see that there are a lot of times we have individuals that can get pretty damn massive among pretty much every species, both among the alligatorids and the crocodiles and other ones as well. But
yeah,
of course, if we look at the average of the species that is statistically more frequently seen and observed on average, I would probably say not quite. But then, of course, with the tail, I have the issue is that it seems that it's overly wide and tall, while from the skeleton, at least based on the angle that has been shown, it should actually be a bit more acute and more tapered. Just like the illustration in the middle shows, I think that's what it should have gone with. That's my personal view on it. But otherwise, it doesn't seem to be a bad design. It seems like they've gone with a very generic sort of plain, sort of drab look of it, which is fine as well. I mean, it could be either, it's like it could go either way. It could be like that. It could be a bit more similar to pattern designs of crocodilians, but we just simply don't know, I suppose, as long as I guess it makes certain kind of sense. Depends, of course, on what your metrics are. Then I would probably say I'm happy to accept that as it is.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I just think it's a little generic considering that...
It is, yes. It doesn't quite tell you that... It just tells me, like, from this image, that and how they used it, I think it just sends a message that it's a crocodilian-looking creature rather than that's a phytosaur.
Right.
They don't exactly even go into any detail, as far as I'm understanding, to specifics of what even defines a phytosaur, which would have been quite interesting if they at least mentioned a few things about it and actually gave a bit more context that, you know, they are not actually what we see as true crocodiles, even though they superficially resemble them very closely. So it would have been nice if they dwelled a bit, although the main point of the show, of course, was to demonstrate how dinosaurs ended up, you know, and what they were and how peculiar dinosaurs looked in comparison to all these other different reptiles that were surrounding them at the time. But I still think it could have been a nice touch to kind of just give us a bit more of that highlight, because it would have further highlighted, you know, how different everything else was around there in comparison to the dinosaurs themselves. So, you know, it's like it would have complemented this show even more, I think, if they did something like that. Like a couple, 1 or 2 lines of it would have been enough, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm happy with everything else. So, if you have do you have anything else to add to this segment?
Oh, I don't mean to drag this out, but there's one more thing that came up in my head, and
really?
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief.
That's fine. That's fine. Go ahead.
I'll be brief. In the beginning, right after they zoom out of the New York City shot, they try and map out where the United States is in conjunction with Pangea, which I think is very nice. But in that section, they mentioned that Pangea was starting to break up. Now, part of my only issue with that, and it's very technical, but Pangea was breaking up a bit later than 220 million years ago. So the implication of that scene was that it was already in the stages of breaking up. And again, I'm not a paleomagnetist, so I could be so if anyone knows some specifics here, let me know. But as far as I'm aware, 220 million years ago, Pangea was still pretty whole, all things considered, and only until after the segment takes place does it really start showing signs of actually breaking apart. But that is a very technical thing that I learned not too long ago, and I just wanted to bring up because I didn't want to I didn't want to forget about it or not do it and then feel like, oh, I should have brought it up just in case. And even if I'm wrong, you know, I'd rather bring it up and be corrected than not know it all. So that's my final note that I have on segment 1 of When Dinosaurs Roamed America.
Okay, sounds good to me, and in that case, I think that's a beautiful moment to wrap it up for the first episode. And if you're new here, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as usual. Of course, you have to, you know, beg, I guess, these days. And if you have, once again, as well, if you're new, be sure to check out some of the older content where me and John discuss reconstructions and where I actually introduce him as an already regular member and part of my crew and part of this channel. Stay tuned for the next episode. I honestly, due to work and other things, I have no idea when this will come, guys, so just want to say that be patient, and I'll try to produce whatever other next piece of content that would be next in queue in nearest future. I'll try to make it happen. Whether it will be the next episode with me and John, or whether it's going to be something else entirely. Could be maybe another next installment with me and Jason if he is available and if I'm available at the same time, or it could be something different altogether, and I just simply have no idea. We all have very busy lives, so this unfortunately comes as a very, very close second or third or maybe even fifth point in our list when it comes to the priorities, but whenever we do get here, I hope that you guys enjoy it nevertheless, and I wish you all well, and I love you all, and thanks very much for coming and listening this long.
Sounds good.
Alright, well in this case, we're gonna end it here, and you guys take care. Bye bye.
Take care.